Okay, well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for this morning's webinar, which is being led by two of the binational interstate policy committees of the Midwestern Legislative Conference. We have the Health and Human Services Committee and the Education Committee. I'm John Davis. I'm from the Midwestern Office of the Council of State Governments, and I serve as CSG Midwest Staff Liaison to the Health and Human Services Committee. My colleague Tim Anderson on the call here is my counterpart for the Education Committee. I just want to introduce you. For those who don't know, CSG is a national nonpartisan association of the states. Among the many groups of the state officials that CSG supports is the Midwestern Legislative Conference. This is made up of legislators from all 11 Midwestern states and the Canadian province of Saskatchewan. Additionally, the provinces of Alberta, Manitoba, and Ontario are affiliate members. The Health and Human Services and Education committees are made up of legislators from across the Midwest. We can advance the slide, please. There we go. They are led by a group of committee officers that you see here. One of the officers, Michigan Representative Brana Colley, is going to help lead the webinar. I first want to recognize Representative Colley, co-chair of the MLC's Health and Human Services Committee, for a few introductory remarks about the webinar. Representative Colley?
Yes, thank you, John, very much. And thank you to my legislative colleagues and everyone else on today's webinar. I also want to take a moment to recognize the work of our three speakers for today's webinar. Thank you all for taking the time to share your experiences and your expertise on indoor air quality with us today, which is a very important topic as we are all emerging, we hope, and also learning to live with, I guess what some would call an endemic at this point. So as legislators, we see the importance of air quality in our local schools and its health impact on our students and their capacities to learn, frankly. And that's why our two MLC committees have organized this webinar today to learn more about indoor air quality policy options and best practices for states. We also hope this morning's presentations will spur plenty of questions and discussion. So please be listening, be ready to participate and share your perspective on indoor air quality. But before we get started and turn it over to our speakers and presentations, let's briefly review a couple of important items. So first, a reminder that today's webinar is being recorded, and a copy of the recording will be made available on the CSG Midwest website after the webinar is completed. Second, we ask that you would please mute your audio to help reduce background noise. And finally, third, we hope to have active participation and discussion this morning. Please type questions in the chat or raise your hand at any time. With that, we truly look forward to learning and listening from the experts that are joining us today with their presentations.
Yeah, and if I may just jump back in here, I would be remiss if to overlook South Dakota Senator Jim Bolin, who has joined us. He is co-chair of the Education Committee. So Senator, thank you for joining us, and we will look forward to your participation as well.
Thank you.
Very good. Yes, thank you, Senator Bolin. And again, we appreciate everyone joining us this morning. And as I mentioned before, we want to extend a special thank you to our three featured speakers, which you should see up on your screen right now. First is Anissa Hemming. She is the director of the Center for Green Schools at the U.S. Green Building Council. Next is Toby Bernstein. She is the director of the Indoor Environments and Green Buildings program at the Environmental Law Institute. And joining us as well is Lily Wang. She is the director of the Durham School of Architectural Engineering and Construction in the College of Engineering at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. We will first hear from Anissa Hemming, director of the Center for Green Schools at the U.S. Green Building Council. Her areas of expertise include sustainability policy and implementation, school district operations, the application of green building rating systems, and disaster and resilience planning, particularly in the school-based context. The council is perhaps best known for its leadership in energy and environmental design, that's all in capital letters, building certification program, which rates buildings on how they address concerns, including indoor air quality. So Anissa, thank you so much again for joining us, and I will now turn things over to you.
Great, thank you. Let's see. Yes, stop other people sharing screen. Here we go. Thanks for having me today. Again, I'm Anissa. I'm the director of our Center for Green Schools. The U.S. Green Building Council promotes greener building design and construction, and also greener communities. And a lot of the work that our Center for Green Schools has been doing over the last year and a half, 2 years, has been on indoor air quality, considering that is something we've been advocating around for a decade or more, and it's become increasingly relevant during the COVID pandemic. So just a tiny bit more about the center. We focus on supporting and training the people implementing sustainability related topics within school systems. So those are the school districts around the country. So we're looking with those staff to make sure that they have what they need to implement the contracts, the purchasing, the practices and programs within their school systems that are going to move forward energy and water efficiency, indoor air quality, responsible use of materials, that sort of thing. And we do that through professional development. We connect them with each other through peer networks, and we do quite a lot of research and advocacy on the federal and state level. We have a network of schools district sustainability staff. It's around 300 people in about 180 school districts. It's about 8 million students or so that are represented through that network, and it's growing by about 20% a year. So we're seeing a real growth in this profession within our school systems around the country. And you can tell they're everywhere. They're not just on the coast, which is what a lot of people assume. They're all over the place. We started this back in about 2010, so it's been sort of steadily growing since then. So that's just a little bit about the type of work that we do. Today, I'm going to walk through a little bit about just sort of what we know about environmental health in schools. Lily will touch on more detail about the research that she and her team have done. I'm going to give you like a broader overview. And then I'll go into some of the ways that school districts are acting on indoor air quality within their schools based on a national survey, 2 national surveys we did, one in 2021, one in 2022. Then I'll go through some federal resources, just make sure you know what's there for environmental health in schools. And then a couple of examples of state level policies focusing on state legislation that relate to all these other things. So this is where we're headed today in my presentation. So what we know about environmental health. So the way that our school buildings and environments are built and operated affects all kinds of different ways of thinking about wellness. You can think about feeling well, then you can think about the actual sort of function of our brain, the cognitive function, thinking well, and then obviously those two sort of contribute to performing well on tests, et cetera. So these are related to each other, but they're slightly different ways of looking at wellness. And so the research into environmental health in schools looks at all these different aspects of how our environments are affecting us. There's quite a lot of research on environmental health in the workplace and in like occupational settings, and a bit less research on the school side, but the effect of contaminants in particular in school settings on children is pretty substantial, because children take in a higher volume of air per body mass. They are generally like lower to the ground, closer to materials, off-gassing, that sort of thing. So there are increased effects on students of some of these things that I'll walk through. So the best like recent compilation was done in 2016, which is getting a bit old now. We're looking at doing another one. But it was done by Harvard, and it's called Schools for Health. I can put the link to this in the chat after I'm done here, but it's a great compilation of the research that's been done over the last 15 or so years on environmental health in schools. And it walks through poor indoor air quality, what that is associated with, respiratory infection, student absenteeism, impaired focus and attention, and then sort of from all those effects, poor academic performance. And when we're talking about poor indoor air quality, we're talking about like poor ventilation, more particulates in the air, viral particles in the air, not just COVID, but influenza, respiratory illnesses. And then we're also talking about volatile organic compounds, VOCs, which is basically off-gassing from materials and construction materials. When we're looking at environmental health, though, we're not just looking at air quality, even though that's what we're doing today. There's also temperature and humidity and effects from that on students and teachers. There's also noise, acoustics, especially for students with any kind of intellectual disability. Acoustics has a really big impact on how well they can learn. But for really all of us, there's actual physical impacts of being around a lot of noise. So, you know, heart rate and stress levels, especially. And then daylight is the other place where the research is quite clear on the impact on students and teachers. So a lot of us think about the benefits of daylight being sort of on your eyes themselves. So being able to see better or being able to turn off the lights to reduce electricity, all those are great benefits. There's also, though, like a circadian rhythm effect on of daylight. So exposure to daylight for kids can really help regulate their circadian rhythm so that they are alert and awake at the right times during the day. And if they have no exposure to daylight and the right sort of spectrum of light, then they can stay sleepy and unfocused at sort of the wrong times in the day. So it has more than just sort of a visual impact on students. Lily's work was funded, not the only work she's done, but the work that I know of Lily's was funded through the EPA STARS grant program, which was awarded in 2013. Actually, I think it was awarded in 2014. And then it was a 3-year grant program to 7 research teams to look at environmental health in schools, the reality on the ground, and then sort of what impacts environmental health concerns might be having on the ground. So there are a couple of interesting conclusions that came out of that sort of build on what I just presented. I'm going to walk through those really quickly, just so you have a sense of the kind of newer research that has been done that was not included in the Schools for Health paper. This one is particularly important for COVID. It is quite clear from all the research that has been done in the last, I would say, 20 years, that our schools are not actually keeping up with the carbon dioxide levels that they should be showing based on code. So, you know, recent schools should be built to code to maintain the right ventilation, to pull out contaminants and pull out carbon dioxide and refresh the air so that there is fresh, healthy air in classrooms. So you can measure that by the level of CO2. And CO2 also, you know, a buildup of CO2 also makes you sleepy and stuff. Is like, we all know that from like the start of an airplane flight, or anybody who's heard from somebody who's been in the submarine. So just, you know, sleepiness and CO2, that does not go well in a school. And schools are just not keeping up with the systems are not working as designed, and some of them are not designed to keep healthy CO2 levels. We're also seeing that school siting is critical. Asthma incidence is really increased near highways and airports, sources of particulate matter. We are also seeing that toxins in the environment can be mitigated by good ventilation. So that's positive, but also related to that first point, a little concerning that our systems are not keeping up. There are also some surprising sources of contaminants in schools, sources of noise and sources of elevated VOCs that you can read about here on the screen. And then kind of related to school siting, but the source of large particulates in a classroom, you can really make a big difference in asthma incidence if you actually do use filtration. So that's an overview of what the research is telling us about environmental health. Happy to answer questions during Q&A, but I know you guys are looking for ways to like do something about it. So so let's move to that next. Excuse me. So in 2021, we put out this report called Preparation in the Pandemic, and we surveyed school districts in our network and in other people's networks, along with ASHRAE, which is the source for a lot of guidance on air quality. And we found some interesting conclusions from the ways that they have implemented air quality measures since COVID. The big conclusions there are that school districts are needed funding. So that was 2021. So it was sort of right before the rescue plan passed. Needed funding to be implementing air quality solutions. And one of the major challenges to implementing what they wanted to implement was that the school buildings are not designed to implement those recommendations. So that's obviously a much larger concern than just like purchasing filters or, purchasing Band-Aid solutions. Some of the problems that our school systems are coming up against and trying to address COVID are really big. Like their school building only uses radiators and has no source of fresh air. Like they can't implement a lot of the recommendations if that's their situation. And so that was very clear in the 2021 report. So we did this survey again and modified it a little bit to understand a little bit more about what has been happening since the last report, and also what's going on with the sources of funding that we know are available right now for school systems. So you'll get this link afterwards, but this is the new report that we put out in the beginning of May. We did this analysis with the Berkeley National Lab, and we collaborated with ASHRAE again. The school districts represented encompass 4,000 schools or so. They are pretty well distributed around the country. We had a really big, for some reason, a big response from California, which was great, but skewed us a little bit west. And we did have quite a lot more representation from city and suburb school districts than town and rural districts. And I will talk a little bit more about that in the responses. Our assumption is that is because those districts are larger, they have more staff capacity, and they have more specialized staff. So they have specialized staff who can respond to a survey about air quality, whereas smaller districts that where there's one facilities person, they may not have somebody that's specialized enough to be able to respond to a survey like we were putting out. Our survey group also skewed COVID cautious. So in particular, these are administrative and behavioral measures that were taken. So not to do with the building, but just to do with policies. And you can see the second item in here is required mask usage, we were up in the 90s. And this was back in November of 2021 that this survey was being taken. And nationally, a national representative survey that Burbio, a data services firm, did showed about a 68% required mask use around the country. So we did this group is skewing COVID cautious. But this is what we found. So we found heavy reliance on heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems, heavy reliance on their ability to bring in outdoor air and their ability to filter air. So those were common measures and very common measures to be implemented. And then down in the monitoring section, very heavy emphasis on assessing how those systems are working and monitoring whether they're working. So these are all positive signs. However, the challenges that that they were confronting in doing these measures are that some of these schools don't have heating, ventilation, air conditioning systems that can actually do these things, bring in fresh air and filter the air. So that's where the challenges are, and I'll get to that in a second. One of the interesting things we found looking from a national perspective is that this is a little hard to read, but the conclusion here is that the rural and town school districts are relying much more heavily on state or local departments of public health. So the vertical line is urban districts when it comes to this graph. And you can see that town and even suburban, the dot and the line down on state and local Department of Public Health are over to the right, which means that they were using state and local guidance much more than the urban districts. This is really important for us to know, and we've shared this with our federal agency partners as well, because we're all putting out stuff on the national level that trying to get school districts to implement things that are sound, et cetera, and they may not be listening to us at all. They are likely going to their state or local departments of health, and so those are the sources that we need to be reaching with guidance, making sure they have appropriate guidance in place for schools. The challenges that school districts are facing, again, HVAC systems are not designed to support strategies that are being put out there. They're also seeing increases in energy use. So some of them are using some of the federal funding, for instance, on increased bills because they just are bringing in outdoor air, and sometimes that's expensive. They are worried about impacts on thermal comfort, especially in very cold climates, of bringing in outdoor air, being able to maintain a good, comfortable environment. So they're having to weigh quite a lot when it comes to implementing some of these building controls for air quality. Doesn't mean it's impossible. It just means they have a lot to consider as they're trying to do this. And then we also looked at challenges to installing in-room air cleaners and challenges to opening windows. You'll see increases in energy use and costs of purchasing in-room air cleaners. And then down in windows, challenges with thermal comfort, again, making sure that, if you're actually having to lean on opening windows, that you're in a climate that can do that without freezing your students. And I know a lot of places are not able to implement that strategy. So the next thing I'm going to talk about are the federal funding sources, but a lot of you guys know the sources that are available. There are the 3 federal COVID relief packages. And when it comes to school funding, the Elementary and Secondary Schools Emergency Relief Fund, ESSER. In shorthand in the education world, these are called ESSER 1, ESSER 2, and ESSER 3. ESSER 3 is the American Rescue Plan funding that is specifically designated for schools. And this just shows the sort of the odds that a school district of varying types knows that these funding sources can be used and is using them for IAQ related improvements. We see that town and rural and suburban districts are less likely than their urban counterparts to be using the federal funds for IAQ related improvements. This could be because they don't know that they're able to be used for indoor air quality. It could be that they are less experienced at using federal dollars for their schools than some of the urban school districts who get federal grants for their schools. So there's a lot of reasons this could be happening. We don't know everything about why there are these trends, but we're making some guesses. All right, so when it comes to those federal resources, and I am a couple of minutes away from finishing, I promise. We've got these three, ESSER 1, 2, and 3. The Rescue Plan Act is certainly the biggest, $122 billion for public education allocation. And a lot of that can be used on facilities, especially related to indoor air quality. We have a guide that outlines some of this, the ways that this funding can be invested in air quality and green school related items. But the bottom line is that a lot of school districts are used to spending federal money on educational operations, like academic operations, and not on facilities, because federal funds usually are not able to be used on facilities. They're precluded. So there's a steep learning curve right now on the facility side about how to use federal money on facilities. And it's something that really could be encouraged at the state level to help school districts understand that it can be used and have some resources to actually implement that and use that money. The other resources that are available right now on the federal side for various environmental health and green schools items come from the bipartisan infrastructure law that was passed in November 2021. The funding that's specifically for schools, there's a large pot for clean school buses that I'm pretty sure you will have heard of. It's $5 billion, so it's a huge pot of money for clean school buses. We also have in that bill, there's also a $500 million program for energy efficiency and renewable energy projects at schools. That's through the Department of Energy. It'll be $100 million each year over 5 years. And there is an emphasis in there on making sure that energy projects also touch indoor air quality. So that's a sort of a dual purpose program. And then there is a continuation and slight increase in funding for the lead in school drinking water programs through EPA. So that's not a new program, it's a continuation, but it's exciting that money was included. And then there are a couple of other blocks in here of money that like schools can be included in, but they're not specific to schools. I've included those here for your reference. All right, and then moving into examples of states. So with that federal action in mind, there are a couple of ways that we've seen states acting on air quality, especially since COVID. So I'm gonna go through 3 of those. We've seen states allocating state and local relief funding to schools. It's able to be used in schools, but states actually have to take that action. They have to allocate it for schools. So there are a couple of examples here of states that have taken some of their state and local money and said, this is the amount that should be used on schools and school facilities in particular. So if you're looking to target school facilities, then that's a really great way of doing it because it's able to be used that way, and the state can have some say in how it's used. The ESSER funding is for everything, just so we're clear. So it is for like teacher salaries and summer learning and instructional materials and like anything that schools need related to COVID, and facilities is just a piece of that. And so that's one of the reasons that a lot of it's not being used for facilities. But the state and local money, if allocated by states for school facilities, can be very targeted. And these 3 states have taken that kind of action. Then there are some states that recently have put in place some additional funding from additional sources to go to school facilities. So there's a couple of examples here that I won't go into too much. New York's is through a ratepayer fund. California's from a different fund as well. So it's kind of, they're just pulling from different sources, but with a more focused eye toward indoor air quality, considering what schools have been through with COVID. And then Nevada passed a bill that instituted guidelines for assessing and monitoring indoor air quality in schools. And that was sort of leaning on the fact that schools can use their ESSER dollars for improvements. So knowing that schools have access to that funding, then, you know, allowed the state legislature to feel more able to implement something like this around monitoring and assessing without it coming across as a pure like unfunded mandate. So it was an interesting approach that Nevada took. So these have the links, so you can access the links soon when you get these slides. So we have a couple of resources that you should just be aware of for your constituents or for your staff or yourself if you want to learn more about IAQ. We've got some fact sheets that are for a non-technical audience about indoor air quality topics. These have some explanations of the mechanics of some of these strategies that you're hearing about that you may not know as much about, like sort of how they work or how to counter myths that are out there. So please use these as you'd like. We also have education on uschbc.org, free webcasts that we've done on all kinds of topics related to green schools. If you go to this education site and search school, there are all kinds of stuff will come up around environmental health and sustainability in schools. We have an annual conference, the Green Schools Conference, that brings together all kinds of different stakeholders related to green schools. And we're actually starting up a network for school district staff, sort of like our Sustainability Directors Network, but this one is going to be specifically focused on environmental health and air quality. So professionals working in school systems around the country focused on that. So if you know of anybody that should join that, go ahead and pass along our email, and we'd love to invite them in. It's free network. Everything we do for school district staff is free. So thank you very much. That's all from me.
All right. Well, Anissa, thank you. Thank you very much for that incredibly helpful presentation and that broad overview, but also you had a lot of very practical suggestions. And I feel, for me, it heightened my awareness of maybe some gaps that where states could help be a conduit to inform our local school districts about some of these opportunities. But before we move on and hear from Toby and Lily, we can open the floor for a few questions or comments if we have any at this time. John and Tim?
Well, yeah, and before we get, there was at least one that maybe we could get to, Representative Colley. And Anissa, you actually looked like you touched on it a little bit right there at the end about what Nevada was doing, but there was a question about how common or uncommon it is for schools or states to regularly monitor what the air quality is in school buildings. I mean, how frequently does that occur in a local school district, I think is the question. And do states potentially have a role in that, just measuring the air quality?
Yeah, before COVID-19, I would say very infrequently. Since the pandemic, a lot of school districts, especially the really big ones, have had public pressure to assess and publish information about air quality within their schools. So I would say a lot of them have sort of grown that capacity over the last couple of years, but they've also been using this federal relief money for it. So there's a possibility that they won't have the money for it in the next few years. It's not typical practice, unfortunately. to monitor air quality in schools. There are very few states that, I'm actually trying to think of examples of states where I don't think there are states where it's required. Yeah.
Yeah, if I can
States haven't
jump,
gotten in there.
if
Yeah,
I can
Toby,
jump
go
in,
ahead.
it's a good segue because I am going to talk a little bit about this.
Good. Yeah.
Okay,
Maybe we should turn things over to Toby right now. I think it is a good segue. That sounds good.
very good. So just a little introduction for Toby. We're all very much looking forward to hearing more. Her work for the Environmental Law Institute focuses on strengthening policies and programs to reduce indoor air risks and also to create healthy, high-performance buildings, like we're talking about. The Institute's mission is to foster innovative, practical law and policy solutions, enabling leaders to make environmental, economic, and social progress. And with that, Toby, thank you very much for joining us today, and we look forward to your presentation.
Okay, thank you. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Great. All right, well, good morning, everyone. And I just want to thank the Council of State Governments for inviting me to participate in this very timely webinar. I'm happy to be here with you to talk a little bit about state policies for improving indoor air quality in schools. As you just heard, ELI is a nonprofit organization. We do research and education on a wide variety of issues, including indoor environmental quality. Our Indoor Environments program has been going on for over 20 years, and I'm going to draw on that work to talk to you and give you just a little bit of an overview of some of the key considerations for developing or adopting a state policy addressing IAQ in schools, and also some examples from around the country. I also want to point out, for those of you who are not familiar with ELI, we're a lot of lawyers, but even though we're based in Washington, D.C., we don't do lobbying and we're not a litigating organization. So our aim is to provide information that can help others in developing policies and programs. There are many aspects of this topic that I won't have time for today. So for example, I'm going to focus on existing school facilities and not really discuss policies related to IAQ in school construction and renovation, which are also very important. But at the end, I will point you to our web pages where you can find all of the information we provide on IAQ policy. So I want to start by noting that IAQ policy encompasses many things because air quality in buildings is affected by a very wide variety of indoor pollutants that can originate both inside and outside a building. As Anissa pointed out, schools might be sited near busy roads. There might be wildfire smoke episodes and other outdoor polluting events. And there are also different products and practices that are used indoors that can produce pollutants and affect air quality. So it's a very broad area of policy. And the term policy itself is also broad. As you know, there can be formal and less formal policies developed at the state level. So today for this presentation, I'm focusing on laws and regulations, and I'm also talking only about state level policies. There certainly may be local policies within a state, and of course, many school districts have adopted their own written policies, and particularly over the past couple of years, that may be even more so. So why is state policy important? Well, Anissa summed up nicely the potentially significant impacts on health and learning from poor indoor environmental quality. And I think Lily will speak to that as well. I think it's important to note that state policies that aim to improve school air quality apply across an entire state. And so they can be important for advancing equity so that it's not only school districts with ample resources and capacity that are able to ensure healthy indoor environments for their students and staff. There has been progress in this area. As I mentioned, our program is over 20 years, and we've certainly seen many states adopting laws and regulations to address certain indoor air quality issues in schools. And this is good news. I'll talk a little bit about that. At the same time, there are a few states, I think, that address IAQ in schools broadly or comprehensively. So there's plenty of room for strengthening state policy. And also with the growing awareness of the importance of indoor air quality and ample information about IAQ best practices, I think there's a tremendous opportunity at this point in time to take a step back and think about how a state's policies can reduce exposures to pollutants and maintain school facility conditions that are conducive to both health and learning. The one place to start in developing school IAQ policies is to consider which area or areas of authority are best suited for an expanded or strengthened role. Because indoor air quality encompasses so many different pollutants and practices, even when we're only talking about one type of building, in this case, schools, and there are many other types of buildings affected by poor indoor air quality, there are a variety of state authorities that could play a role. The main authorities with respect to existing school facilities are going to be health, education, and labor, though there may be others. And of course, when it comes to school construction and renovation, there will be other agencies involved as well. In most states, at least one of these areas of authority are already involved in school facility conditions or operations, and there may be laws and regulations on the books that can be strengthened. So in terms of labor, for example, and I'm talking here about occupational safety and health rules, there are around half of the states that have their own, I'll just refer to them as OSHA rules that govern public and private workplaces, which includes schools. And these state rules must be as strong as the federal OSHA requirements, but they can also go beyond the federal standards, which generally don't really address indoor air quality in schools. And a few states have done this. So New Jersey is unusual as a state that has a separate IAQ rule for public workplaces, including schools. And this has been in place for more than a decade. More recently, during the pandemic, California and Oregon are two states that have adopted OSHA rules for the COVID pandemic that do include IAQ related provisions. So for example, ventilation and filtration. Even within a particular area of authority, such as health, education, or labor, state administrative agencies and programs do vary a lot. So there isn't necessarily a one-size-fits-all approach to addressing IAQ in schools when it comes to policy. But at a general level, I would suggest 3 elements that should be considered when developing a policy approach. The first is required standards and practices. And so these are the measures most people think about when they think about IAQ policy, the best practices that schools should be taking to prevent IAQ problems and to address any problems that may come up. And there are many state laws and regulations that do address one or more IAQ issues by establishing requirements of some kind. And then another key element is a framework for oversight and compliance to make sure that the requirements that may be adopted by a state are not just words on the paper. And this is tricky for this and any area of policy, and it's probably where existing state policies are weakest. And last but not least, financial and technical assistance are really critical when it comes to school facility conditions generally, and are also important as an adjunct to required standards and practices, especially to assist schools that are under-resourced and historically disadvantaged. Anissa discussed a little bit about the funding that's been available in recent years, but the needs are great. So it's an ongoing issue when it comes to the state of school conditions and indoor air quality as well. So I'm going to say a little bit more about the first 2 of these areas. For sake of time, I'm not going to talk about school policies that provide financial and technical assistance. Anissa did mention a few that have been adopted over the last couple of years. We'll be providing more information about that in the coming months, and I'll mention that later. So I want to start with oversight. Really, the framework for state oversight of school environmental conditions, I think, is at the heart of a school IAQ policy. And it does raise very complex issues regarding the roles and responsibilities of state agencies, local agencies, and school districts when it comes to managing school facilities. It also raises important resource considerations for the state and local agencies that are charged with overseeing the requirements. School facility inspections are one important oversight tool. States that inspect schools for maintenance and operating conditions do so through regular inspections and through inspections on complaints, sometimes both of those. So there are a number of states that do have a requirement that state or local agencies inspect school facilities annually or more often, including for issues related to environmental health. And this is typically through the state health authorities. So Ohio is an example of a state with a health law that requires local health departments to inspect schools twice a year. And there are a number of other states with health laws that also require either the state or local health department to inspect. West Virginia is an example of a state with an education law that requires the state to annually inspect schools that are built with state funds. There are a larger number of states that have requirements for state inspections of schools in response to complaints. And this is because, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, about half the states implement OSHA rules that do require the state to investigate employee complaints. So the occupational safety and health agencies do these inspections. They can also do programmed or regular inspections, but that's less common. Outside of the OSHA context, the most notable state policy is an Indiana law that requires the State Department of Health to establish an IAQ inspection and evaluation program for state and school buildings, including a requirement that the department conduct an inspection if it receives a written air quality complaint. So this has been an ongoing program for a number of years. I would just mention a few important considerations for developing an inspection requirement. One is how often the inspection takes place. I think it's important to have a stated frequency, at least annually. There are some state health laws that require periodic inspections by local health departments, but this can result in some local agencies doing regular inspections, but other local agencies not, depending on resources and priorities. It's also important for an inspection policy to spell out the IAQ related criteria that guide the inspection. And most state school inspection policies are not particularly strong in this regard. They don't often spell out the indoor air quality criteria. Indiana's IAQ complaints program and rule, though, does include a number of IAQ criteria that guide the Department of Health inspections of schools in response to complaints. And it's also important for an inspection policy to be clear about what happens if deficiencies are identified during the state inspection. Are they noted in a report? Is the school required to correct the problem? And again, in the case of Indiana, a report and recommendations are provided by the Department of Health, but the law doesn't strictly require a school follow-up or provide enforcement authorities. Reporting is another important oversight strategy. There are a number of states that require schools to report to the state certain information about school facilities, excuse me, but usually this is related to more to capital funding programs. So this would be not information on an ongoing sort of operations and maintenance basis, excuse me. But one interesting example here is New Hampshire, which requires the submission of an IAQ checklist that schools have to complete each year. The checklist includes a variety of different indoor air quality related aspects. There are also some state laws that require schools to develop and submit to the state an IAQ management plan. Minnesota, Wisconsin, New Jersey, and Connecticut are examples of laws that span the health, education, and OSHA context in that regard. I just want to mention that, getting facility information to the school community is important given the limited resources of the state to oversee school facility conditions. The New Hampshire education rule that I mentioned does require IAQ checklists, and the Department of Education has begun to post those checklists on their website. So those are available to the public. States could also require schools to provide information directly to the community about the state of their facilities and the conditions in their facilities, either by posting online or at school district meetings. And then another related approach that could be important is to require schools to designate a point of contact on indoor air quality issues. This sounds very basic, but it really can help the state oversee facility requirements and work with schools if a problem is found. But it can also help the community know who to work with within a school administration to try to address any problems. Indiana and New Jersey have requirements along these lines. And then just a word about enforcement. So in the occupational safety and health context, there's a detailed enforcement regime, as you're probably familiar with, in the event of occupational safety and health rules. But outside of that, only a small number of states really have enforcement spelled out in their health or education laws or rules that relate to school facility conditions. In general, formal enforcement and the issuance of any type of penalty, which is a typical enforcement measure, are not prominent strategies when it comes to schools. The focus is more on state and local authorities working with schools to help them correct deficiencies that are found. So turning now to pollutants, products and practices that can create IAQ problems. As I mentioned, there are many indoor environmental pollutants and many that are subject to some kind of state law and regulations. You may be familiar with asbestos, the framework for asbestos. This is an example of a pollutant that has been regulated at both the federal and state levels. The federal AHERA law and regulations require schools to inspect for asbestos containing materials, prepare management plans, and take action to prevent or reduce asbestos hazard. And there are around a dozen states, including Illinois, that have been delegated authority to implement and enforce the federal AHERA rules, and those states can establish requirements that go beyond the federal provisions as well. And there are some pollutants not regulated at the federal level that are nevertheless the subject of state laws. Radon is a good example there. There has been a slow but steady increase in the number of state radon laws over the past 30 plus years. Most of these deal with the home environment, but an increasing number of states are developing policies addressing radon in schools. Several weeks ago, Iowa became the 8th state to require radon testing in schools. And some of these policies, including Iowa's, explicitly require mitigation if high radon levels are found. This is an area of opportunity for other Midwestern states, many of which have high average radon potential. Illinois and Indiana currently have laws that encourage school radon testing and mitigation, but not requirements as far as I'm aware. So while asbestos and radon have been a subject of regulation for a while, there's a law addressing polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs, that was just enacted that I think is the first of its kind. Vermont passed this legislation last year, requiring schools constructed or renovated before 1980 to test for PCBs, and the law provides state funding for the testing. The health department there recently created screening and action levels to guide the testing. And just a few days ago, I think last week, the legislature in Vermont amended this law to require the state to submit a report that talks about what type of what they're finding and with the testing and what type of remediation might be needed and possible sources of state funding. And PCBs could be an issue, particularly in fluorescent lighting fixtures and potentially in older caulk as well. Mold and moisture, very common IAQ problems that affect a lot of people, but not commonly regulated in schools. In developing policies, I think it's important to note that public health experts do not recommend mold testing as a regular practice, and there aren't widely accepted quantitative air quality standards for mold or dampness, but there are best practices for mold and moisture prevention and remediation. And some states have incorporated these into their rules that govern schools. So that would be New Jersey and California in the occupational safety and health context, and Indiana's health school complaint inspection rule also addresses mold and moisture. Indoor exposures can also come from common maintenance and operation practices, such as pesticide applications and cleaning and disinfection. To address exposure to chemical pesticides, a number of states have adopted laws and regulations. We've identified around 20 states, including Illinois, that have laws requiring schools to have an integrated pest management plan. And states have also adopted other measures that govern how pesticides are applied, including restrictions on the use of certain pesticides and required notice of applications. Cleaning and disinfection were extremely high-profile topics at the beginning of the pandemic, before airborne transmission of the virus was recognized as the more important risk. But well before the pandemic, some states began to take policy action to reduce the risk of exposure to cleaning chemicals in schools. There are at least 8 states, including Illinois and Iowa, that require schools to use green cleaning products to some extent. And then ventilation, of course, is a key practice that impacts indoor air quality by providing outside air to dilute indoor pollutants and filtering air to remove harmful particles. As Anissa alluded to, and as we all know, awareness of the importance of ventilation and filtration grew exponentially during the pandemic and as a key strategy for infection control. But public health and building experts have known for quite a long time that ventilation is a key to maintaining good indoor air quality generally. So ELI is going to be developing a report on state policies to improve school ventilation and filtration. It's going to describe the recommended best practices for ventilation and filtration, and also review how those practices have been incorporated into state policies. I'll just say briefly that there has been an uptick in policies addressing school ventilation over the past couple of years. One area has been funding for ventilation upgrades, which Anissa spoke to a bit at the end. The other has been in the occupational safety and health arena, with a few states enacting COVID-specific rules for workplaces. Outside of those 2 areas, there haven't been many new laws or regulations on ventilation. Our report will talk about pre-pandemic, long-standing laws and regulations, but there hasn't been a lot of development over the last couple of years. But I do think in the coming months and years, we will see some new legislation, some new rules as states consider how to use the lessons from the pandemic to institutionalize and implant best practices for the future. Our report's going to be available, I think, sometime this fall, later in the year. It'll be available on our website, which is up here on the screen. All of our IAQ policy materials are here. I've only touched on some highlights, so there's a lot more on our webpage that may be of interest. In addition to research reports like the one coming in the fall, we have policy briefs. We also have a database of state indoor air quality laws, and that's organized by state. So you can take a look there and see if there are any IAQ laws that or regulations that we have listed for your state. And I'll also point out our topics and school environmental health resource, which has charts for 9 different environmental health and IAQ issues, and those charts list a number of state laws as well. So you can go, it includes radon, mold, and a number of other issues. So you can go there and see what we have listed for your state. If you have any questions about the materials on our website, or if you're having trouble finding them, or any questions about IAQ policy in general, I would invite you to contact me at the email address on the screen. I'd be happy to talk with you about that. And with that, I will end.
Well, Toby, thank you so very much. Very helpful to learn about all of the IAQ resources that your organization provides for state legislators right at our fingertips. I personally was not aware of how extensive your work was and how helpful it will be to us as legislators. So thank you so much. As a reminder to everyone on today, please send along any questions or comments that you have into the chat or raise your hand. And we will open up discussion after we hear from our third presenter, Dr. Lily Wang. Dr. Lily Wang is the Charles W. and March H. Durham Distinguished Professor of Engineering and Technology. She's also the director of the Durham School of Architectural Engineering and Construction in the College of Engineering at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln campus. So Dr. Wang, thank you very much for joining us, and please take it away when you're ready.
Thank you very much. Does everybody see the slides, I hope?
Yes, we do. Thank you, Dr.
Thank you.
Wang.
So I apologize. I have been overusing my voice in the past few weeks, so it's going to sound a little bit rough, but I am thrilled to be here to tell you more about the research projects that we have been doing at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. I am presenting this on behalf of my colleague, Josephine Lau, who is our indoor air quality expert, but she is out on maternity leave right now, although I think she might be listening in on the call. And the project that I'm going to tell you about is also the other co-principal investigators were Clarence Waters and James Robert, the first three of us being in the Durham School of Architectural Engineering and Construction, and Dr. Robert being in the Department of Educational Psychology. So I'm going to tell you about the results of this project that you heard Anissa refer to. Our project was called Evidence-Based Interactions Between Indoor Environmental Factors and Their Effects on K-12 Student Achievement. And it was one of the 7 funded by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency under their EPA Healthy Schools STAR program. And it started in 2014. It was actually a 5-year, I think it was 4-year, and most of us got a 1-year extension. So this was the 5-year period that we did our project in. And our particular question was, how do indoor environmental conditions in K-12 school buildings impact student academic achievement? We didn't only look at air quality. We looked at several of the other components that Anissa also introduced. I particularly am an acoustics expert, so that's actually my circle right there. Clarence Waters is an expert in lighting quality. As I said, Dr. Josephine Lau, our expert in IAQ and thermal comfort. And then we had Dr. Jim Bovard as an educational psychology and statistics expert. So looking at all these factors and demographics and how do they impact student performance. We were very keen that our research project build on the previous research that had been done. And Anissa shared the report that came out in 2016. And we had surveyed several of the same findings. Many of the previous work had only looked at 1 or 2 environmental variables at a time, but we were very interested in making sure ours was more comprehensive, that didn't just look at acoustics or just look at indoor air quality, that we were looking at all of the different variables. Many previous studies also had occupants rate their subjective views of variables, but we were interested in having more objective measurements that could be logged in time as well, not just at one moment during a school year. There were previous work that looked at indirect measures about such as absenteeism, but we wanted to be looking at more direct measures of what was the student achievement scores, what is the demographic data in these different districts we're looking at. And some of the previous work did not have great statistical rigor or effective experimental design, but by having this team where we were each experts in our discipline, as well as Dr. Robert, who is an expert in guiding our experimental design analysis, we felt that we could improve on what had been presented before. So our study involved 220 classrooms in 5 local school districts here in the Omaha-Lincoln area. And you can see the breakdown of primary and secondary and high school classrooms. We made both occupied measurements where we left sensors in the classroom and it logged data over 36 hours. And we did that 3 times. So we would do that once in the fall, once in the winter, and once in the spring. So we had 6 days of logged data on many different environmental metrics. We also accumulated some measurements after hours when the classrooms were unoccupied, typically after school was dismissed. And so these are just some photos of different sensors that we had placed in the classrooms that we measured. That's a sound level meter. I think that's a luminance meter. And we also had a test kit by the teachers' desks. So the types of measurements we made, this kit had formaldehyde monitors, particulate matter, carbon dioxide, a sound level meter, a luminance meter. Also, we had the hanging sound level meters. We had carbon dioxide meters, more luminance meters, and also we wanted to know whether the doors were open or closed. So there were also door state loggers. These were all the ones that were left in the classroom to log data over time. As I said, we also made some measurements after hours because we wouldn't have expected those things to change very much, like the geometry of the room, how much light a room typically gets through the windows. So we did also take a number of other data after hours. The primary reason for doing the ozone in an unoccupied is that device actually makes a lot of noise, and so we did not feel comfortable leaving that device in an occupied classroom condition. So we just did that after hours. We did also accumulate demographic data because it's well known in the literature that the demographics of the students can impact their student learning outcomes, and we wanted to control for that. So these are the types of demographics we got. We knew the classroom aggregated number, so we averaged it per classroom, the percent of students that received free or reduced price lunches, the percent of them that were identified by the district as being a gifted learner, and the percent in each classroom that were identified as being special ed. And the school districts that partnered with us was great because they gave us these two outcome variables. It was the student achievement scores on math and on reading as a percentile rank. So here's some sample data. These are the 5 school districts that we worked with. And you can see this is the percent of free and reduced lunch recipients by the district. So we did have a range of different demographics, with district C and E having the lowest percent of students that had free and reduced lunch, but then we also had some that had greater. So these are box plots where the red line shows you the median value, the rest of the box shows you the 25th to 75th percentile, and then the whiskers show you the maximum and minimum, and the red crosses are sometimes outliers, are called outliers. So this is just showing you that this is part with demographic data we would get. And to see the achievement data, this is an example of by grade. We focused on 4 grade levels, 3rd, 5th, 8th, and 11th grade. And we would get their data, again, averaged by classroom, so that there was, it was not personally identifiable. And you see the same type of, same kind of box and whisker plots, and that typically these are the percentile rates that we were getting in each of the grades, as well as the range. So let me give you an overview of the measurements we took. My expertise being acoustics, Dr. Lau's being thermal conditions and indoor air quality, and Dr. Waters being lighting conditions. But since today we're focusing on IAQ, I'm going to focus more specifically on the different conditions we measured there: gas phase contaminants, ventilation rates, particulate matter. You've already heard about these from the previous 2 speakers. So just a little more detail, what we measured then under each of those 3 categories. Under gas phase contaminants, we had carbon dioxide, both measured coming in from the supply into the room, as well as we had meters around the room to calculate an average carbon dioxide reading in the room. Formaldehyde, total volatile organic compounds, carbon monoxide, and ozone. Ventilation rates were estimated, as is common in the field, from the carbon dioxide values during occupied times. And then we also did have measures of the particulate matter, both at the fine size and also at coarse sizes. Here's an example of what you would see if we looked at our raw data. So along the x-axis here is time, and these are different meters, and you can see them logging the data either continuously or discretely, depending on how the meter worked. And we have lots of this data, as I said, over 220 classrooms, 6 full occupied days of this data, which we then had to slice and dice into different metrics that we could run the statistical analysis on. So let me share some of the findings. One is, as you heard earlier, I believe it was Anissa that mentioned it, that yes, very commonly shown in all of our studies that we do not meet the ASHRAE standard for what the minimum ventilation in classrooms should be. The red line shows that guidance given from the 2010 version of the standard. And these are the classrooms that are meeting it. They are higher than that ventilation rate, but almost 75% of our classrooms that we measured did not meet the suggested minimum for classrooms. So that is an ongoing issue. This is an aggregated value from, I said we went 2 days in the fall, 2 in the winter, and 2 in the spring. And so we do have seasonal data. This chart happens to be an annual viewpoint. But when we did the statistical analysis, we did actually look very closely at seasonal variations. That was something that was different about our study that we thought that previous research did not focus on as much. So here's what I can tell you about what we found. So let me start with math scores. So when we look at math scores, the significant findings statistically were that the type of mechanical system had a very significant effect on math achievement. Also, the fine particulate count in the fall, because now I'm splitting it up by seasons, and also carbon monoxide concentration were found to be significant. Here on math, one of the things we wanted to highlight is that when a classroom had unit ventilators operating within the room versus being maybe a ducted variable air volume system or other things like that, those classrooms did have lower math scores when compared to classrooms with multi-zone systems. So this one right here was very much a significant finding. I'm going to jump now to reading scores because that's where we see more on the ventilation rates. So this is outcomes on reading scores. These are the statistically significant variables, and this is just statistical numbers. The p-value tells us that it is statistically significant, and then we've tried to help interpret what it means. So let me just say that ventilation rates as measured in fall and ventilation rates as measured in spring were found to be significant on reading scores. So higher ventilation rates meant that there was a positive association with reading achievement when you hold everything else constant. And there was also an interesting interaction with the demographic of gifted students, that as the percent of gifted students in the classroom increases, greater ventilation rates actually had even more positive outcomes on their reading achievement. All right, it's a lot of statistics, but just to let you know that our findings did show that ventilation rates in the fall and spring, and then there were also some other variables that were found to be significant. Now, what's interesting is we very clearly saw there are seasonal variations. So ventilation rates in winter for the same classrooms were always significantly lower than the ventilation rates were in the fall and spring for those classrooms. And Anissa kind of touched on this, that it's pretty cold in Nebraska, so we wouldn't want to necessarily be bringing in a lot of cool air in the winter. And so there was difference in ventilation rates in the winter, and that might be why we don't see that same finding in the winter as we do in the fall or spring. Okay, so I just want to point out that our current study doesn't show causation. We didn't affect any change in the classrooms and then see an improved student achievement on math or reading. We basically did what we would call an exploratory study, where we cast a wide net of 220 classrooms, and we can show that there are correlations, that these rooms that had higher ventilation rates, even seasonally, particularly in the fall and spring, had better reading achievement scores. But future studies should certainly be working with school districts to test specific changes in manipulation so that we can get at the heart of what we want to know, which is the causation. Other work that we have been talking about as one of the recipients of an EPA Healthy Schools grant was that there are 6 other institutions that receive these grants, and some of them also took very similar data. So we're trying to do some meta-analysis of all the data that was gathered from those. And another point of future work that we hope others will consider are looking more at individual data, we studied classroom aggregated data, 7,000 students learning in those classrooms, but it could have been interesting also to look at more individual student data. Now, there is some ongoing work happening at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. So my colleagues, Dr. Josephine Lau and Dr. Jim Bovaird, are PIs on this new grant that just got funded. It's called the Efficacy of Air Filters in Classrooms on Student Academic and Learning Outcomes. So I was very proud. This was funded through Nebraska Legislative Bill 630. They partnered with the Nebraska Department of Education. And so it was funded starting in last September and running for 2 years. And so this team is now collecting data from at least 300 3rd to 8th grade classrooms. And each of these classrooms is being randomly assigned into a treatment or a control condition with regards to having air filters, I think, in them. And this is going to be run over 2 consecutive school years. So it's been run this year as well as this coming academic year. And their main research questions are, again, just like we did with our EPA study, we're going to control for demographics, for grade, for school districts. They're going to add rurality in it too. Do students in classrooms with these air filters achieve higher academic learning outcomes than the students who are in the control condition? So this is now getting at that causation where they are effectively making a change in some classrooms, and let's see if there's a difference. They're also interested in answering, is there a difference between the indoor air contaminant levels when they've installed the classroom with an air filter? And lastly, there is, of course, these variation in ventilation rates. So do they, in participating classrooms, relate to student outcomes? So that's a summary of what I have to present here. Is pictures of the teams that we worked with over the EPA study, but Dr. Lau and Dr. Bovaird will be continuing on that other study too. And these are the 2 papers specifically on indoor air quality from our EPA grant that if people are interested in reading more about that. Thank you.
Well, Dr. Wang, thank you very much, and for all of your work and leading in the research area that is so needed as data is collected so that the correct policy decisions can be made. That's not possible without knowing the outcomes of some of these measures that we're talking about. So thank you. And thank you to all of our speakers for their very helpful and insightful presentations. And now we are going to move on this afternoon or morning, depending on where you live, and open it up for questions and discussions. As a reminder, you can send along any questions or comments that you have into the chat, or you can raise your hand and we'll move forward that way. I do have one quick question, and then I believe there are a few questions in the chat, and John and Tim, I know, will relay those. But just one thing that caught my attention early in our webinar today, Anissa had mentioned something about smaller schools, particularly in rural areas, which happens to be the type of area that I represent, being, for whatever reason, not taking advantage of some of the federal grant opportunities that would relate to the actual buildings. And so often school funding does not, it's more related to salaries or the classroom instruction. And I believe it was mentioned that states could help raise awareness. I was wondering if there would be any particular suggestions on how state legislators from these more rural areas that have a lot of smaller schools that we could do to help school districts know that this is something that's available.
Yeah, I mean, the issue of funding for rural school facilities is a really deep rooted one, because as we all know, the school construction dollars come from local tax bases, and where there is no existing state program, or where the state program is limited to give state funds to local districts for school construction and facilities, where that's true, then sort of the locals have to pick it up all themselves. And that does exist in several states around the country where it's all on locals. So that is a really sort of national issue that extends beyond COVID. The COVID relief funding and sort of the lack of knowledge about using that for facilities. I would say that the sort of the avenue for that information is through the Department of Education's grant administration office. A lot of those offices themselves need to be encouraged to reach out to school districts about the availability of funds for facilities. They are also not very well versed in using federal funds on school facilities because, as we discussed earlier, they're not usually able to be used. So I do think there's some kind of action that state legislators can take to kind of put a little bit of pressure behind the grant administration office at the Department of Ed to put that information in the hands of school districts. And then, as I mentioned, the state and local funds, the COVID relief funds, are also a good avenue for raising the awareness of federal funding being able to be used in schools, because you can actually direct that a little bit more clearly.
And just to follow up, Anissa, you had mentioned a few states in your presentation that had specific laws that specifically said, okay, this amount of money is going to be spent on air quality or environmental issues, school environmental issues, right? And then
Yeah,
way too, to make sure the locals, regardless of size, are able to use those funds.
yeah, absolutely. Yep.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. That's helpful.
Sure.
Appreciate that. John and Tim.
Yeah, well, John Blair, if we can read the question, but I thought, John, if John Blair is here, he had a few questions that I thought maybe he could unmute himself and ask the questions himself. John,
Okay.
you mind hopping on?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. I'm an engineer and I've worked with some local schools in the last year. And on the public side in my area, I live in Illinois, Springfield, Illinois. The public school districts are doing a pretty good job of at least trying to mitigate indoor air quality issues with regards to COVID. On the private side, the non-public side, they've pretty much taken the position, if it's not required, it's not a problem and we're not doing it. One particular grade school, and it's a large grade school, they were, in lieu of ventilation, it was fogging. And as far as I know, they're still doing it. Once a day when school's out, they fog the classrooms, and that's their COVID mitigation effort. And anyway. With that said, in Illinois, we don't have any actual requirements which deal with schools that have classrooms without mechanical ventilation. And in some of the schools down here, I mean, they've got classrooms in which were once storage areas with no windows. And I've reached out at every level, the local, county, the state level, the federal level, and everything's a recommendation when it comes to basically ventilation issues in classrooms. There's a lot of recommendations, but there's no requirements. And so currently, I'm trying to work with a state legislator to try to get some a law or a draft bill. I've drafted some language for a bill to be possibly passed in the fall veto session, and it addresses these two things. One is it would require HEPA filtration units size for the room, or that would provide a minimum of air changes, like 6 air changes per hour in classrooms without mechanical ventilation. And the second would require all classrooms, it mirrors Indiana's existing state law, which says the CO2 levels cannot exceed 700 parts per million plus whatever the outdoor carbon dioxide level, which says 400. So it would be approximately, the indoor CO2 levels couldn't exceed approximately 1100 parts per million in any classroom. Anyway, so if I could get feedback on that, that'd be great.
Yeah, I can address the sort of building science part of it. And I'm wondering, Toby, if you could address like who can require what or what models exist for that. The requiring a specific technology, HEPA air filtration units are a good, they're technology that is well proven to take things out of the air that we don't want in there. So that's a good strategy. But the reason that they're recommended and the language isn't stronger is that it's often a better idea to give people as air change rate or something along those lines to target with the various technologies they have within the space. So the level of, and you're an engineer, you know this, the level of filtration available and ventilation available in various systems varies greatly. So requiring a specific, making a line about like whether you have ventilation or not, and then saying you have to use a specific technology about that is a little bit, it might yield some unintended consequences for who has to purchase what and why.
Well, that would be the point. These would be classrooms that have no mechanical ventilation.
Right, but what
Basically.
about inadequate ventilation is what I'm saying. So sometimes there's a variation there. And so you're establishing a hard line of ventilation or no ventilation, but there are plenty of classrooms that have inadequate ventilation. So there's
Well, I'll give you an example.
well, we have 3 minutes,
Go
so I
ahead.
just want to make sure that
Oh,
we're
okay.
able to get through,
Okay.
like,
Yeah, that's fine. Go
give
ahead.
everyone on the call enough information to kind of go off of.
Right.
The CO2 monitors is a great strategy. I just, as an engineer, you know this, but filtration is not going to get you lower CO2, right? So
Right.
even where you have really great filtration and no ventilation, you're still going to have a buildup of CO2. And so you're also going to, have problems with dealing with that sort of interaction between how you get clean air into a space that also is low in CO2 to keep kids focused and not sleepy, et cetera. But we generally do advocate for CO2 monitors being put in all classrooms, whether or not they have mechanical ventilation available, because often mechanical ventilation fails and we don't know about it unless there's monitoring. So I'm all for that.
Yeah, I think the idea, real quick, with the CO2 monitors, it prevents, right now, it's easy for the administrations to look the other way. And I think if you've got it in the classroom, that basically the teacher's made aware that, there's an adequate ventilation issue,
Mhm,
then they have to address it however they address it,
mhm.
even
Yeah.
if it's as simple as opening more windows.
You
Because
know,
the school I was talking about, there were teachers that they wouldn't open the windows either.
Yeah.
For
Yeah.
allergies and for different reasons. Yeah.
and before,
So-
because Nisa was right, we're running up against when we were when we go to, there was a question that came up when Toby was talking, and Toby, if you could just address this real quick. You mentioned, the idea of, when states do require some of the observations and reporting of air quality, and even sometimes requiring mitigation. How common is it for states to provide kind of funding or technical assistance for schools to address some of the concerns that are found based on, the measurements in a school's air quality?
Yeah, I would say funding is a big issue. And I didn't get into this in my presentation, partly just because of time. But in the report that's coming up on ventilation, we will talk about both general funding programs for ventilation programs that have come up during the pandemic. It's really a mixed bag. I mean, so for example, there are some states that provide funding for radon mitigation, right? Colorado has an interesting program for low-income homeowners. The Vermont law requiring testing of PCBs will probably lead to some state pool of funding to deal with the problem. But one of the reasons that state policy at this point is fairly general when it comes to indoor air quality requirements for schools is precisely because of the cost that attaches to remediation. That's why I use that as the third element of policy. You have to think about, how schools are gonna meet these requirements and also generally meet the needs. But there's also funding for the state and the local health department. So I just want to make one quick point, which is that school inspections by state, for example, health departments, that's important, both in terms of oversight, but also technical assistance and support for school districts. But state agencies don't necessarily have the capacity, and certainly local health departments don't have the funding to do that. So they tend to inspect only the things that are required and funded. So greater support for local public health, for example, can help those agencies go out to schools more often and work with schools to address ventilation and other air quality issues that maybe are not being addressed right now. I'll stop there because I'm looking at the time. It looks like we're getting close.
Yeah, well, Representative Colley, thank you so much for facilitating this. And gosh, I want to thank all three of our presenters. Just to have you on here and to share your expertise and do such a wonderful job of sharing it in a way that really is impactful for our audience. We really, truly appreciate the work you do and your willingness to share it with us. And Lily, good luck to you and your colleagues at University of Nebraska too. That the actual findings of your research is so helpful, I think, for us to connect it with legislators and other policymakers in terms of the policies we make on indoor air quality. So I do want to thank to all of you. So again, special thanks to our expert speakers. Real quick, just reminder for everyone who's on the call that the MLC, the Midwestern Legislative Conference, will be meeting in person on July 10th to the 13th in Wichita, and registration for that is continuing. So I hope you all can join us in Wichita for sessions on education, health, and a whole lot of other things. So mark your calendars and please register for that event. All the material, this webinar will be posted on our CSG Midwest website soon. We'll provide links to all the different resources that were mentioned by our presenters today. And just lastly, again, thank you everyone for joining us, and I hope you have a great day and a great weekend. Take care.
Thank you.